We all know that the technology here in San Francisco and Silicon Valley has created enormous technological breakthroughs over the last many years. It's also created an astounding amount of wealth. And much of that wealth, because this is the United States in the 20th and 21st century, has been concentrated into the hands of a very few. These have become some of our greatest philanthropists of our day, and they have been entrusted with figuring out how to deploy that wealth. And many these days are trying to use it to address climate issues. I know many of you were looking forward to hearing from Maureen Powell-Jobs, and I regret to inform you at the very last minute she was unable to make it. These are the unpredictable times in which we make it. So we apologize for that. Nevertheless, we've still got a great panel lined up for you. We've got John Doerr about to join me on the stage, the chair of the venture capital firm, Kleiner Perkins. And we've also got Dr. Andrew Steer, the CEO and president of the Bezos Earth Fund, joining us remotely from his home in Washington, D.C. So John, please join me on the stage, and we should have Andrew right here. Thanks, John. Andrew, hi. Can you hear us loud and clear?
Hear you clearly. Thank you very much, David. And how cool it was to start with music. I love the way you do things because we need the right as well as the left part of our brain to solve these problems.
Ooh, I love that framework. We'll have to come back to that later in the conversation. Thank you, Andrew. Well, John, thank you for being here. Thank you to all of us in the room. I love seeing a full house after lunch. People are truly ready for this conversation. It's great. John, I want to talk with you. Earlier this year, you entrusted me with helping tell your story, and we were the first to break the news at the New York Times that you were giving a really extraordinary gift to Stanford University with a $1.1 billion endowment to create the Doerr School of Sustainability.
We were joined with many other generous donors.
Yes, there were other generous donors.
$1.6 billion effort.
Amazing, 1.6 total. Okay, but you're holding your book, or it's right there, Speed and Scale. We've also talked about this over the years.
I'm a struggling author.
Okay, and this book, which I'm sure John will find opportunities to talk about, maps out his 10-point plan for how to really quickly address the climate crisis. But John, I have reviewed this book. I have reviewed the poster in the book.
What do you think?
Nowhere in there did I see on that list of to-dos a contribution to a well-endowed university as being a part of the solution. And in all seriousness, I ask, why was this the best use of your money? This extraordinary gift, which I think is deservingly getting some applause in the audience. Why did you feel like giving $1.1 billion to Stanford, which already has an endowment of some $29 billion, was the best way for you at this moment when you're so urgently focused on moving the needle on emissions to help with that project?
Well, Stanford came to me and my family with an amazing plan that they'd taken 2 years to develop. Deliberative polling of the faculty and the students. And the faculty matter a lot in a university campus, as you know well. They said the universities of the 20th century are failing us. They will not solve this problem. We need to focus on impact above and beyond, and in addition to publish papers and research and train students. And Stanford has some standing when it comes to impact. Mm-hmm. Over the last 50 years, Stanford alumni have founded or co-founded 39,000 companies, an amazing impact ecosystem. Here's some of the thinking that my family had. We need that same kind of an impact ecosystem around the climate problem. And we need Stanford to be enormously successful, but we need it to be a model much more than Stanford. We need innovation around our great universities, just like we have them around our great medical schools. And so Stanford said, we want to network with others, work with others, and I don't believe the world will solve the climate crisis unless it marshals the great universities and colleges and community colleges around the world to bring the full force of of their power, their innovation, their ability to mobilize workers against this awesome challenge.
Okay, well, it is an awesome challenge indeed, and clearly Stanford is now positioned to be a big part of the solution, which I know everyone in this room certainly hopes they will be. Andrew, thank you again for joining us virtually. Andrew, the Bezos Earth Fund, of which you are now the CEO, was founded in 2020 by Amazon founder, of course, Jeff Bezos, with a commitment of $10 billion from Mr. Bezos. Now, that is a huge commitment to climate, but it was only, I remember this so vividly, I was on Twitter one day in 2017, and Jeff took to Twitter and said, what should I do with my money? And so it's clearly a relatively new priority for him. I know you can't necessarily speak directly for Mr. Bezos, or perhaps you can, but will you give us a sense of why it is that Jeff has chosen this topic, of all the ones he entertained from the masses on Twitter who replied to his tweet, to focus on? Why is this the thing that he has decided to focus on?
Well, look, it is so exciting, isn't it, that people with wealth are turning to this important issue. This is the defining challenge of our generation. And it's a time when real leaders say, this is when we want to lead. Who wants an easy job? We want to solve major problems. And I think that is precisely why it attracts. It's a huge problem. It requires a whole range of issues, political skills, financial skills, technical skills, scientific skills. And just to come back to your question to John, I mean, I think it is absolutely superb what John has done. We absolutely need new ideas. We absolutely must harness the power of the best universities in the world. And what's great about the Doerr Center is that it is not just the physicists do one thing, the biologists do something else. The whole point is it's sort of multi-disciplinary, and that's exactly what we need. We will only solve the problem if we have new ideas. And back to the Bezos Earth Fund, of course, if you have created one of the most successful companies in the world, you basically have learned how to turn dreams into reality. And you've gone through the entire stage from research all the way through marketing. And in a way, that's the exciting thing that philanthropy is now doing, is recognizing that, you know, we may have 50 transitions that we've got to go through this decade and the next. They're all at different stages, and they often will need different elements. They may need basic research. They may need political advocacy. They may need monitoring and accountability. They may need a whole bunch of things. What philanthropy can do is come in quickly and sort of, if you like, disrupt a little bit, remove barriers. And that's what we're trying to do at the Bezos Earth Fund.
Great. Andrew, let me stick with you for just a few moments. The Bezos Earth Fund has already started to distribute its money to make its grants. You've invested in conservation efforts, restoration, food system transformation. Will you just very briefly give us a sense of how Jeff has begun to spend his money on climate and how you think this will shape up in the years ahead? What's the roadmap in the near term? In just a minute or two, please.
So the fund addresses climate and nature. And basically, you can't solve climate without nature. But we don't just do nature because of climate. We do nature because it's beautiful. It's part of our future. And so we've now dispersed about $1.5 billion. And in the first year, we spent quite a bit of time focusing on that nature agenda and asking, where do we really need to do things differently in order to prevent this massive destruction, which, by the way, will cause just much, much worse climate change. So we picked, for example, the Congo Basin, very, very difficult part of the world. And instead of sort of saying, let's identify the best institution, we'll finance that, we got the 10 best institutions, we got them together, and we said, look, you've all been engaged for decades. How about doing things differently? How about not only doing the brilliant science, the brilliant park protection, the brilliant whatever it is you're doing, how about doing it together as a team and do it with us? And then we can talk at the head of state level. We can talk to the big European donors. We can talk to the American government. We can actually then start putting together a coalition whereby we might be able to reverse the loss that we have. And so that's the way we're thinking about it. Now, we don't just do nature, although we've done a lot of that. We're also doing decarbonization of industry, the hard to abate sectors. We're doing a lot at the moment on environmental justice. And the reason for that is that not only is it a moral challenge, but actually if you want to solve the problem, you really want to engage those that are on the front line. And so, for example, we've made $300 million of grants to organizations in the United States that are run by BIPOC, Black, Indigenous, and people of color. And for internationally, we put a coalition together to commit $1 billion to provide through indigenous organizations in the great forested areas of the world.
That's great. That's great. I mean, an extraordinary range, and themes that I keep hearing in my reporting and even the conversations today are the mix of leverage, right? These public-private partnerships where you can really harness not only the ability of one organization, but also governments and educational institutions, and also this, everything in the kitchen sink, which is, well articulated in some of John's recent work, which really shows that this isn't just about fixing the energy system or the transportation system or the agriculture system. We're going to need to do a bunch of things at the same time very quickly, and they're going to need different sorts of things. John, I want you to give us a little bit of a history lesson here. We got to take a step back. We got to rewind, because John, as many of you know, 15 years ago was on the real leading edge of the clean tech revolution, if you will. This early surge of investment, of venture capital dollars into clean tech companies, many of which, unfortunately for John, though he's doing all right, did not work out so well. They were considered some of the biggest failures in the history of venture capital. John, I'm not trying to rub it in, but using your own words against you, you called your investment in EV maker Fisker the worst investment decision of my life, quoting you. What didn't work about that moment? Can you put a number on it? How much money did you lose?
Well, I can put a number on it. And the last I checked, we'd invested $1 billion in 77 companies, and it was worth $3 billion. So we made money. We didn't lose money. Maybe we didn't make as much as we would have wanted.
Yeah.
But one of the great things about venture capital is you can only lose 1 times your money.
1,000x returns, 1x losses. Fair point.
If we go back to that moment in time, how many of you remember watching Al Gore's movie, An Inconvenient Truth? Well, that changed the worldwide conversation. 7 million people viewed it in the first year. The largest demographic was school teachers. Yeah. So he put this issue on the world's agenda in an accessible way, and he put it in my face in the form of my 16-year-old daughter, Mary, who after dinner, we gathered around the table to talk about it. Some of my Republican friends said, well, the science, it looks like the world's warming. Not sure it's man-made. You remember that meme? But when the conversation came to Mary Doerr, she looked at me and she said, Dad, your generation created this problem. You better fix it. And the room went silent. I had nothing, I didn't know what to say, and my friends didn't either. So I set out with the Kleiner partners to gradually, over time, invest in, look for sustainability solutions. Climate Tech 1.0, which has been, its death has been prematurely exaggerated, to be sure. If you wanted to be the most successful economic investor in Climate Tech 1.0, there was one rule, and that is back Elon. Because at the time, my team and I had the opportunity to invest in a brilliant designer of automobiles, Henrik Fisker, or ambitious, probably pretty difficult to work with entrepreneur by the name of Elon Musk. And we made the wrong decision. Yeah.
So very briefly, what, if anything, is different now about this moment compared to that moment 15 years ago? What gives you faith that some of these investments are going to pay off perhaps more than 3 to 1? And where do you see the biggest potential right now?
Well, first of all, I think it's still true that the climate investments are going to take longer to mature.
Good to
will
know.
Require more capital, and I think they require more genius, more competence in and among the founders. But this is a far different time than the time of An Inconvenient Truth. There's greater funding available. One of the key results of my plan, which I promised you I'd get a word in edgewise, was to increase all forms of capital and in particular venture capital, from 13 billion when we wrote the plan to 50 billion a year. You know what it was last year? $53 billion of venture capital. That's done. We've achieved that. We've also got to increase philanthropy. We've got to eliminate government subsidies for fossil fuels. We need to increase globally funding in R&D. But there's no question, but the markets are larger, they're more accessible. We're further down the cost curve to reduce the green premium. And so Larry Fink says he's predicting he'll see 1,000 climate unicorns. Those are climate tech companies worth more than $1 billion. My figure of merit, the Gates Breakthrough Energy Fund's figure of merit is, how many gigatons of carbon can your project, your venture remove? That's what we've got to do. We've got to cut emissions and cut them fast.
We got that. That is the number one thing. And I feel like that can often get lost in all the dialogue around carbon. Is at the end of climate, is at the end of the day, exactly that is really the first, second, and third thing we need to be talking about. Andrew, I want to turn to you. In your role, I know you're overseeing this large and growing organization, but I have to ask, and I'm sure many people in this room are curious, what is your relation with Jeff like on the climate front? Are you helping, as someone yourself who has worked in this industry for years and years, who knows the science, who knows the front lines in a visceral way, are you helping educate him and Lauren about the challenges ahead? Are you helping shape his views and how he thinks about these most critical issues, and perhaps also how he, as chair of Amazon still, thinks about running his company?
Well, Jeff doesn't need any education from me, but it is exciting, isn't it, that some of these global leaders in the corporate sector are increasingly becoming global statespersons to change the world. And that's, as someone that didn't start my life in the United States, it is absolutely inspiring, quite frankly, to see how at a certain stage in their career, doesn't mean they give up their business, but they also play that role. I mean, you're sitting next to John Doerr. He is one like that, who not only gives, but actually speaks. And so, you know, with Jeff and Lauren, it's been fantastic. This year we went to Colombia, we went to Gabon, and Jeff gave an incredible speech last year at COP26 in Glasgow. And so, yes, for me, one of the exciting things about this job is not only the fact that, I mean, what a privilege to be able to use funds so flexibly to change the world, but also to engage with, if you like, a process of change that is necessary, because we don't only need the right messages, we need the right messengers, and we're lucky to have one.
Good. And help us understand to what, if any degree, there is a relationship between the Bezos Earth Fund's priorities and Amazon. And I ask that knowing that, for example, there is a new fund, which I think you're focusing on at COP27, focused on deforestation. Cynics might see that as a response to Amazon's footprint when it comes to carbon and transportation and packaging, for example. Are these two things related?
No, we are totally separate. We don't work for Amazon. We obviously we work with them because they are a real important agent of change. You know, Jeff, just shortly before he set up the Bezos Earth Fund, he also set up the so-called climate pledge, which said, you know, science is telling us we need to reach net zero by 2050, but actually, why don't we create a club of front-leading companies that will do it by 2040? And Amazon will do that, and we're going to buy 100,000 electric vehicles, etc. Now there are 370 major companies that are signed up the climate pledge. So yeah, just as we would want to engage with any major corporation that you know, without whom, quite frankly, we're not going to solve the problem. I mean, we need governments to do their job, we need corporations to do their job, we need the financial sector to do its job, and the corporate sector is obviously fundamentally important. And something is going on now that's very exciting. I mean, over the last, but it's also worrying. Over the last couple of years, you've had these companies making these pledges, which are really wonderful. And some of them are moving forward brilliantly. Others are actually finding it's quite difficult. And so we're actually at quite an important stage right now. And that's one of the things that we think about quite a bit in the Bezos Earth Fund. How can we be helpful to make sure that this cohort of Fortune 500 companies actually can get to where they genuinely want to get.
Yeah, that's going to be a major theme of the conversation I have with Brad Smith later this afternoon. Brad at Microsoft, as you know, has really taken responsibility for trying to bend the curve of Microsoft's emissions, and so we're going to get into that in detail. John, I want to talk a bit more about the school. When I wrote the story announcing the gift, the extraordinary gift of $1.1 billion plus another 500 from other donors, there was a bit of controversy that was stirred up, and it came when the founding dean of the school, Arun Majumdar, said he would be open to working with fossil fuel companies. And I hear you say that the most important thing is rapidly reducing the emissions of greenhouse gases. And then I go on the Precourt Energy Center website right now, and I see that the Precourt Energy Center at Stanford, which is now a part of the Doerr School of Sustainability, has the Chevron logo on that site right now as a sponsor of some of the content. Can you clarify the school's relationship with fossil fuel companies, and to what extent, if at all, you believe it's going to be part of that work as the school expands to partner with some of the companies that have historically been some of not only the largest emitters, but some of the largest obstacles to reducing emissions?
Yeah, let me try to paint the whole picture there. And Stanford's relationship with fossil fuel companies turns on faculty first and foremost. It's an academic institution, and the faculty have freedom to get funding from whatever resource they want. And the school and the board have nothing to do with that part of the Stanford organization. Now, they have several institutes whose purpose is to reach out to industry, to engage industry in innovation and in agendas. And some of that work is funded by fossil fuel companies. There are fossil fuel companies that are committed to driving to net zero by 2050. Not many yet, but more and more. And I dare say we need to get them there to solve this problem. The question the students raised is, should the school, the institutes that are part of it, and the school's operations itself accept any funding from a fossil fuel entity, a fossil fuel company? And Dean Majumdar said, I want to go on a listening tour. I want to get everybody back on campus post-COVID, hear the views of the faculty, the students, the researchers, the stakeholders, and then I'll come forward with a decision for the school. So I stood up at the opening of the school and said, I stand with the students when it comes to getting off fossil fuels. I also stand for academic freedom, and I want the community to go through this process to come to its correct conclusion.
And so has the dean made that decision yet?
No, he's on that listening tour now.
Okay. Well, we will see. And that obviously raises an enormous set of questions about even if the school or the institute or the university doesn't want to work with these companies, why certain professors may still accept funding from them. A topic for another panel, I'm afraid. Andrew, before joining the Bezos Earth Fund, you were leading the World Resources Institute. You worked at the World Bank. You had a front seat to the climate conversation for many years, frankly, before the New York Times was doing climate events. So you come with some real perspective here. And I wonder if you could give us, with that perspective, your view on where the most urgent changes are needed. John's got his plan. I'm going to ask him about it a bit more in just a sec. But when you see all of the things that need to be done, what is number 1, 2, and 3 on your list on the most urgent and potentially achievable changes that need to be made?
So I agree totally, by the way, with John's 6 big sectoral transformations. What we do is we then break them down into what you could call sub-revolutions. We run something called the System Change Lab with the World Resource Institute, and we monitor these 50 changes that are required. Now, some people would say, well, I mean, shouldn't we pick the most important one and focus on that? Well, unfortunately, 10 years ago, you could actually choose what to do. But now, you actually have to do, you have to do all of them if we're going to solve the problem. So 10 years ago, if you were running a steel plant, you could say, well, actually, it's very expensive for me to decarbonize, so I will pay someone else, through carbon markets. But now, given where we are, that steel needs to be decarbonized much quicker. Now, it doesn't mean this decade that they'll go at the same pace of decarbonization, but they need to be investing this decade in order to decarbonize much quicker next decade. And so you actually need, in a technical way, without wanting to overdo it, something called a marginal abatement cost curve. And a marginal abatement cost curve says, look, let's go for the things that are cheapest. And then gradually, as we need to reduce carbon more and more, we go up the abatement cost curve and you pay more things. Unfortunately, we've now moved along the horizontal axis so far that we sort of have to do the whole lot. So we actually have to invest in, technologies like carbon capture and storage, even though they might be expensive. We have to invest actually in thinking about a generation of aircraft that can actually fly without emitting carbon, so to speak. But obviously, there are some huge ones, as John shows in his book. I mean, obviously, decarbonizing the grid is the biggest single thing. We're focusing also on, for example, transforming food, which is huge. I mean, food is the reason that we're losing the forests, and losing the forest is absolutely killing us in terms of any chance of being able to solve the problem. I mentioned the Congo Basin before. The Congo Basin forests hold more carbon than the Amazon forest and the Indonesian forest combined. And yet they're under huge threat. So we've got to act on that, but you can't do it unless you think about reforming the food system, for example. So you asked, is there a lesson? And the lesson is, sort of pretty obviously, there are no silver bullets for the most part. It's a jigsaw puzzle. Yeah. And what we need to do is think about the coalitions that bring in the government, that bring in the scientists, that bring in, and you actually need to think about the whole piece. If you want to stop deforestation in Indonesia, there's two words: palm oil. That's what's causing it. But you can't just ask your government to stop. It's impossible. You have to talk to people that are going to the supermarket here, because you and I have used palm oil 3 times today already. Yeah. We're relevant to this. So too, the traders in Singapore are relevant. The Smallholder Association in Indonesia is relevant. Unilever's, etc. You've got to put that whole piece together. That's what makes it so exciting. And that's why we need sort of a combination of philanthropists, venture capitalists, governments who care, and we need to urge each other into a sort of, if you like, upward spiral, an ambition loop, we call it.
It is an everything and type of moment. I want to remind you, for those of you in the room here, you have note cards. You can ask questions. The way to do that is to write your question and your name, pass it to the edge of the aisle. A producer will find you. And we have, I just learned, we have a pop-up Slack channel that has thousands and thousands of people commenting and following along. So fantastic. These few people in the room, we're delighted to have you here, but the audience is exponentially larger than that online right now. So
what's the name of that Slack channel?
I have no idea.
They'll put it on the screen for us.
John, back to you. And let's keep talking sort of brass tacks about this transition to a net zero economy, right? It's not just one thing. John's got the whole list there. And yet, I'm looking at the numbers every day. John, you're looking at the numbers in probably even more detail than I am, because you wrote the book and you're tracking these things one by one. I want you to give us your clear-eyed assessment about how much progress is really being made and how likely it is we are actually going to stay below 1.5 or 2 degrees Celsius of warming from the temperatures before the Industrial Revolution.
Okay, let's agree on what we must do to get there. And
okay, but you still have to answer if you think we're going to get there.
I will do that.
Okay.
But let's talk about what there is.
All right, quickly.
Quickly. For the people in the room and in the viewing audience, you can get the plan at speedandscale.com. And the plan says we have to go from 59 gigatons to net zero by 2050 and halfway there by 2030. And there's actually pretty broad agreement on how we do that. We electrify transportation, we decarbonize the grid, the biggest source of emissions reduction. That means use wind and solar and safe nuclear instead of oil and gas to generate electricity and coal. We need to fix our food systems, which Andrew has been very eloquent about already. That's voluntarily reducing the amount of beef that we eat, moving to regenerative agriculture, reducing food waste. We need to protect nature. We've got to stop destroying the rainforests in the Congo, in the Amazon, and stop deep ocean trawling. We need to clean up industry, how we make cement and make steel. And after we do those 5 things, we will not have gotten to 0. We'll only reduce 49 gigatons per year of emissions. So we're going to have to remove remaining stubborn carbon through mechanical and natural means. Each of those is 5 gigatons. Planting more trees, or what's called direct air capture.
Okay, I'm going to stop you there because Andrew said he agreed with your first 6, and those were the first 6. Next question, because we're running short on time, is how close are we? I mean, you just started to answer it. The truth is, on many of those measures, progress is moving enormously slower than it needs to be to meet some of the ambitious targets you yourself have set out.
I told you that. I agree with that. And that truth is evident when you move from the goals, which are ambitious but relatively easy to state, to the details of the plan. 55 measurable, time-bound, quantitative key results in a system invented by Andy Grove of Intel. OKRs is the framework that we use. And so on some of these, we're in good shape. But for most of them, we're off course or even code red. We built this system so we can track our progress, we can do mid-course adjustments, and we can identify people who will exhibit the best practices and sign up for their own key results to achieve these results. I'm not here to tell you that this is the best plan, or even that it's anything more than one plan. But it's a plan where the numbers add up. And this plan, if executed, will get us to 1.5 degrees centigrade warming by 2050.
Yeah. And I regret, and you acknowledged, that we are not on track as a society, as a globe, to meet that plan. And here I want to go back, just briefly, because we're running so short on time. I want to go back to Andrew. And Andrew, again, with your perspective, as someone who worked deeply at the World Bank in developing economies, as someone who headed the World Resources Institute and knows the real firsthand effects of climate change and what that looks like. We are on a path now to blow past 1.5 degrees warming, to go past 2 degrees easily, and potentially higher. I don't want to end us on a dour note, but what does that look like, Andrew? What does that world look like that we're rapidly careening towards in the years ahead? And how are the problems we're already facing that are related to climate going to change and perhaps get worse as a result of all that?
Well, it's going to be very grim if it gets worse. It's already grim. Hurricane Ian wasn't caused by climate change, but it certainly was strengthened by climate change. Look at the famine that's emerging in southern Madagascar. That is caused by climate change. We now have science that is able to assess a causality, and every year is getting worse. The good news is that we are waking up to that. And a really important point is that, we have the naysayers that say, oh my goodness me, I mean, electric vehicles only account for 1 and then 2 and then 3% and then 4%. It'll take us forever before we electrify automobiles. What they're missing is the whole point of cost. Once you reach price parity, you don't do the increments anymore. It flips very quickly. And we're starting to see that. And that's just one example. And we're seeing it throughout the developing world, where it is now clear that renewable energy is cheaper. And what we're seeing now is a country like South Africa, a country like Indonesia, which is currently chairing the G20, is saying, look, we have a whole bunch of coal plants generating electricity. Would it be possible to, with some financial engineering, a little bit of subsidy, could we decommission them? And so South Africa is moving ahead, Indonesia moving ahead. The Minister of Finance, Sri Mulyani, last week was sort of laying out a plan. They're hoping to go forward. So what's happening is we have got to stop thinking about the possibility that is purely incremental, and we've got to think of those hockey sticks which are caused by a change in calculus and a cost that goes below parity. So whilst we are absolutely failing, second derivative is in the right direction now, and there may be a hockey stick out there in each of these 50, and we are going to work our socks off to make it happen.
Well, those hockey stick graphs are the things that venture capitalists dream of.
Yeah.
They are the things that I know John and his partners at Kleiner Perkins have been chasing, both in the consumer tech space and now in the climate space. And I know that the kind of thing that your beneficiary is enormously familiar with. So we thank you, Andrew, for being here with us today. Continue the good work. John, thank you very much for being here, for talking us through your speed and scale plan and the details of the school.